Hello and welcome back to another video. So this was originally going to be a bit of a discussion video about some of the pacing issues with Warlords of Draenor gearing. However, the main problem that I have is actually going to be fixed in patch 6.1, so I'm just going to start off by giving you the news. Now, currently in the game, a daily challenge mode will give you a item level 640 bit of gear, which is of course a little bit redundant because you can get bucket loads of 640s from the LFR. The good news is that in patch 6.1, you will get item level 660 stuff from the daily quest for completing a challenge mode. Now, of course, the LFR gear will get more powerful in Blackrock Foundry. I think it's 650, might be 655, but roughly that. So this gear will actually be better from the challenge modes. So now that the news is covered, it's time to just move into the little discussion topic that I was going to do, and perhaps how this is a good improvement, but maybe not a 100% fix. So initially in Warlords of Draenor, gearing was actually quite fun before the LFR came out because it incentivized you doing heroic dungeons and many other varied things like that. However, since the LFR came out, basically the sort of route of least opposition to getting powerful gear is doing the LFR. Now, just should be noted that this video is not criticizing LFR or saying that the LFR gear should be taken away or anything. This is more just about Blizzard sort of poorly working things out, in a way. Now, I think that the LFR gameplay, perhaps, just from a raw gameplay perspective, isn't as good as Heroic Dungeons, because, at least in the Heroic Dungeon, you kind of need to have your head, well, you don't really need to have your head completely switched on, but you get what I mean, right? There's more responsibility in each individual player, whereas the Warlords of Draenor LFRs are, as I think we've all noticed, something that really is extremely trivial. Now, what that essentially has meant is that really it kind of undercuts the Heroic Dungeon gameplay, which I think is more valuable gameplay. Also, remember that you can get in to the Warlords of Draenor LFR at item level 615, which is the same eye level that you need to get into Heroic Dungeons. All of this, I think, together means that Heroic Under Dungeons, wow, what the hell was I saying there? No, Heroic Dungeons are pretty much undercut by LFR. There is no real reason to do them, right? And I suppose also some things like maybe, you know, tokens from your followers and stuff like that are a bit trivialized by the LFR as well. And really, I think this is more just of a balancing problem from Blizzard's perspective. Now, ideally, I think that there should be a tier of dungeons which gives you better gear than the LFR. Why? Because, well, ideally those dungeons would be harder than doing an LFR, and I think all of us can agree that a meritocracy where doing the harder content means the better gear is you know, the way things go. Now, of course, the obvious flaw in their original implementation was that the challenge mode tier of dungeons, which are a good bit harder, only gave you item level 640 bits of gear, meaning that you could put in a whole bunch of work to get a bit of challenge mode gear, or you could just do the LFRs, which now have got a bit of a higher drop rate, and get bombarded with 640s. There really was no reason to do heroic dungeons or challenge mode dungeons after the first month of the expansion's release. And that's, I think, just overall damaged the gearing experience, because above LFR gear, well, you're either getting, you know, the odd bit of gear from your garrison missions, or you're maybe moving into normal raiding or something like that. I suppose by skipping a few steps, it just cuts away a good bit of gameplay there, and perhaps doing that after only a month wasn't really the best decision. However, as I said, this is not a problem with the LFR, this is a problem with how Blizzard are kind of balancing out their gear. So I think that the way that this ideally should have been is that, of course, when Warlords came out, you had the challenge modes maybe giving you a bit of 650 gear, right? Because perhaps you don't want it to be 655, maybe not as good as a bit of normal raid gear, but I think 650 would have been pretty good. It would have been significantly more powerful than the gear that you get from LFR, which is completely reasonable because the challenge modes are significantly harder. And overall, I think that would have been good. But of course, in patch 6.1, it's going to be there at 660, which will be better than the Blackrock Foundry gear, and I think that's just going to make a more enjoyable gearing up process. Now it will be the case that if you're just, you know, if you're a player who's, you know, maybe not into raiding, right, in the big sort of organized sense, which I totally get, it's not for everyone, but you've got a tightly knit guild of friends and family who maybe are able to do a challenge mode, because you've got to remember, you don't need to get a specific time in the challenge mode, you just need to complete it to get that gear. So now your gearing process will be, you know, gearing your character up, you know, to 615, maybe doing some LFR, and then once you're ready, hopping in to these harder challenge modes to get some, some really good gear from hard content, and I think overall that's just a really good improvement for the game. But near the start of this video, I did say that I don't really think it's a perfect implementation or a perfect solution, and that's because I feel like this, method of giving a bit of good gear from a challenge mode is kind of, it's like a hacked-in version of Mythic dungeons. Let's be honest, we all sort of wanted Mythic dungeons. That was the big discussion back a while ago, because a Mythic dungeon would essentially, in my head anyway, be the difficulty level of a Cataclysm Heroic. And of course, because of that, people would know what they were getting into. Maybe it would require a gold Proving Grounds. So I think that the pug-related issues of the Cataclysm 5-man heroics wouldn't really be there if this was the sort of top-tier heroic dungeon that was a LFD thing. I think it's possible to do decently tricky LFD content as long as you've got the Proving Ground thing in there and it's giving you gear that's better than LFR and there's a decently high expectation there. Just as a little side tangent actually to help illustrate a point, I was watching one of Preach's videos recently and then also one of Asmongold's videos about doing normal dungeons, because of course the normal dungeons don't have that Proving Ground gate on them, and apparently there's just some superior, amazing levels of derpishness going on in there. Now, in Cataclysm you had that level of derpishness being applied to heroic dungeons. Well, if we were to do Mythic dungeons that were harder, that had a gold Proving Ground, I think it would cut out the super derp people, because there is actually a raw DPS requirement to complete a gold DPS Proving Ground, and it would sort of cut out the derp people. So essentially my point is that with a little bit of gating via a gold Proving Ground medal thing, you should avoid those Cataclysm derpy problems, which would allow for LFD hard content, or at least it's Cataclysm heroic levels of difficulty, which, let's be honest, they weren't insane when you were with a guild, but I still have got great memories of things like Grim Patrol and Stonecore. I thought they were extremely enjoyable, and having that content back in the game would be nice. And I know a lot of you are probably saying, well, look, for all intents and purposes, the challenge modes pretty much do that, and I mean, yeah, they do, but it's not really the same as a dungeon. First of all, you've not got traditional dungeon-style loot. Now, I think if you were doing dungeons that gave you really, properly good bits of gear, you would have to tone down the drop rates so that people couldn't just chain run dungeons in a day and be loaded up in a full set of 660 gear. I think that certainly would be a little bit too much. But that's one thing. I think people might miss that loot system. Also, because it's a challenge mode, you've got the time trial element, which does actually drive some people off. You've also got the normalized gear element. Now, that's both a plus and a minus. It's a plus in that the difficulty level relatively stays constant, but it's a minus in that people don't really feel like their character's progressing that much because they're always normalized to the content. I don't know how you'd really implement that with a Mythic dungeon level, because eventually you are going to outgear it, but I suppose the idea is that if it's hard enough to be sort of considered a kind of top-end light version of content in terms of just the raw numbers requirements, then maybe outgearing wouldn't be as massive of a problem. Yeah, I think it could probably work if it wasn't, without normalized stats. And then, of course, probably the biggest sort of knock to participation rates is the fact that it's, it's not a puggable thing, the challenge modes. And I don't think challenge modes should be puggable. That would be kind of ridiculous. But if you were to do a Mythic difficulty that had a gold Proving Ground requirement, and had a sort of expectation of high gear, maybe it would require a 630 item level to even go in or something like that. Well, if that was the case, then I think that would weed out most of the bad people, meaning that a LFD experience would be pretty good. Though I suppose one slight concern would be queue times if you are cutting out that many people, but perhaps I think that would be okay, because a lot of people would be queuing as parties anyway and might only need to fill 1 or 2 spots. So I'd say that overall, it could probably work. Maybe it's an experiment that they'll do in the future. I know that quite a while ago, it wasn't this time last year, was it maybe in like somewhere between March and June, but I remember the devs saying that at some point in Warlords of Draenor, they might consider adding in a extra dungeon difficulty, maybe halfway through the expansion, if they were going to add new dungeons to the game. Now, I don't know if we'll get new dungeons. That was a very long time ago, and of course, as Warlords of Draenor has taught us, really forcing Blizzard or expecting Blizzard to stick by the word of a year and a half ago or a year ago isn't really the greatest idea if you don't want to be disappointed by things. I don't really know or perhaps even think we'll get new dungeons or this Mythic difficulty, but perhaps in a future expansion it would be something that they could consider. Basically, I think it would solve a lot of problems and it would provide a decently tricky bit of content that's at the higher end of things for people who just enjoy doing dungeons. Who maybe don't want to do the whole challenge mode thing, and I'd say that also Mythics just, in general, if done right, could be more appealing and garner higher participation rates because of all the reasons that I listed before. So there's just some general thoughts about the whole thing. I know that Mythics and challenge modes are sort of, in my head, they're kind of similar but different, so I'm going to expect loads of comments down saying, oh, blah, blah, they're the same thing, and yeah, I do partially know what you mean there. But the biggest point of this video is the main issue with the LFR essentially undercutting content should be kind of solved in patch 6.1 if you're in a guild and you're able to get enough people together to do a challenge mode. It probably won't be much of a change for those of you who are not in a guild with people who are up for doing challenge modes. So there you go, bit of news, discussion and all that stuff. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.